Hi, grade 10. So we asked you to make your own classification scheme. First of all, for what is living and what is not living. And then of the living things, how did you want to classify them? So I saw several different classification systems, most of them both based on what how science has classified things. But you could classify things in many different ways. So if we had this group of organisms here, you might classify them as like insects or butterflies, amphibians, jellyfish, plants, but you could also just classify them as blue and yellow. Why not? Why do we decide to classify things the way we do? Why do we decide there's 5 kingdoms or 7 kingdoms? Why do we split things into animals and plants and not green things and blue things and red things and things that grow up and things that grow across? And why do we do it the way we do? And maybe you think, oh, it has to do with how they're related to each other or their features. And you'd be partially right, but not quite. Let's look at some other classification schemes and how people classify things. The Aboriginal people in Australia, well, I think many Indigenous people classify things as edible versus not edible because that's what's useful to them. The Aboriginals also would classify things like, it didn't matter if it was living or dead, they were all the things that were used to make a canoe. Well, that's useful. If I know all the things used to make a canoe, I can just collect all those things together and make a canoe. Things used to make musical instruments. They had things that were spiritual or godlike or parts of the gods, and things that were secular or for the people. The people from the Torres Strait Islands, which are between Australia and Papua New Guinea, they classified all the things that had fins or flippers, right, and swam in the open ocean as whaler. So that meant sea turtles and dugong were in the same classification. But even though nowadays, for our classification scheme, we would see sea turtles. I'm going to leave that in. We would see sea turtles as leatherbacks, green sea turtles, a bunch of different ones. But they had many. They just had one sea turtle. They recognized it, just like, oh yeah, there's that sea turtle again. But dugongs were so important to them. They classified them as based on their age. So were they a calf, or they were a mother with a calf, or they were a senior male, or they were a young male, or they were a male out roaming. They have many classifications. And so here you can actually see their classification scheme. Some of it depended on which clan they came from, from the Torres Straits. But here's the whaler, and then Waliki is the dugong, and from the Waliki then we have all these different classified organisms. So maybe you think like, well, nowadays, or we don't do that, or modern people don't do that. I mean, that's fine for Aboriginal people, but we have to have a common language of science. We have to be able to talk to each other and know what we're talking about. Well, this here is a picture of an algae, what we would call red algae. It's actually a cyanobacteria, so it's not really an algae, even though we call it an algae. And we can also look at these guys. These are all algae as well. They're all what we call seaweeds, and yet they are in different groups. Some of the what we call algae or seaweeds are bacteria. Some of them are green plants. They are all over the place with where we would put them in some kind of scientific classification scheme. And yet we're quite comfortable to call them all seaweed. This Red Sea, by the way, this is caused by this cyanobacteria that grows when we put too much fertilizer in the water. So from the farms in the surrounding regions, the fertilizers are flowing off down the streams into the water and feeding the cyanobacteria so that they grow and multiply and reproduce, and they produce a toxin. And actually this algae or this cyanobacteria, will kill a lot of the fish in the area when it gets to this kind of population density. So even in what we think of as, something that we all know what a seaweed is, we actually don't all know what a seaweed is. They're different things. Oh, here's some more algae for you. Okay, so here's a very nice picture of a tree of life. And why is it organized this way? Because if we look down the base here, we've got the origin of life. And in the 19th century, we had a number of people looking at fossils, having ideas about change over time, and coming up with the idea of natural selection, and that all the species perhaps have come from one common ancestor. And so the main person that we think of is Charles Darwin, who came up with this idea. But he actually published his first paper with a young man called Alfred Russel Wallace, who was also very interested in this and wrote to Darwin with his ideas. And they matched Darwin's ideas and they published it together. So we have now, so now we group things based on their evolution, right? Well, no, we don't. We actually go back even longer ago, 200 years ago, to a man called Linnaeus. And Linnaeus thought that all the living things in the world, the world was created by God. And he was talking about a Christian God. He was a Christian man. And so he thought if we look closely at things, we could see the hand of God in those organisms. And we should be able to figure out, well, how did God group them? How did God make them? Can we see what God's pattern is? Linnaeus did say, if you don't find my system useful, then improve it and make a different one. He was just putting one out there that could be useful to people. But strangely enough, even though we have had Darwin's ideas and this idea of a sort of tree of life for a long time, we still group things without a lot of reference to evolution. So we kind of group them evolutionarily. We try to. We're slowly changing. But that change means that some areas of taxonomy or classification represent evolution and some don't, like our algae, like our seaweed. So how are we going to classify? We need to be able to have a common language to talk to you in this class. So what are we going to use in this class? Okay, so we've got 3 domains. Down here, we've got the archaea, and my animation's in the wrong order, but these archaea are found in deep sea vents, in volcanic lakes, in very salty water, very extreme habitats, and I'll tell you why in a moment. And then we have the eubacteria, okay, which we just normally just call them bacteria. And now my sign for archaea will come up. Okay, so many, many, many millions of years ago, when life first formed on Earth, the atmosphere on Earth was quite different than it is now. And the archaea were the first organisms to kind of put together some proteins and create life. Life emerged from the muck, from the mud, from the steaming vents, from the volcanoes. And as life evolved and continued to develop across the globe, it started to change the atmosphere, and there started to be a relationship between the atmosphere and the living things. And when that atmosphere changed to have a lot of oxygen, as it does now, it killed off 99% of the archaea. Only the ones living in very extreme habitats, like deep, deep in the ocean, where there was little oxygen, managed to survive. And so now we find archaea in these very extreme habitats. So they are a type of extremophile. So an extremophile is an organism that lives in a very extreme habitat. Then we have, so the eubacteria. So of the surviving sort of organisms on Earth, the bacteria started to flourish. They could use oxygen. And we see eubacteria all over the planet now, taking on many different roles. And then from the bacteria just held their genetic material, just let it float around their bodies. They have little bodies, they're single cells. So their genetic material floated around. But the eukarya decided to package up that genetic material and put a membrane around it, put it in a little case called the nucleus. And so this is what we call the eukarya. And inside the eukarya, we have the prototista, the fungi, the plantae, and the animalia. So, how does this all tie in? So we've got our three domains: archaea, eubacteria, and eukarya. In 1988, Lynn Margulis and Schwartz proposed the five kingdoms system. And we're going to ignore viruses right now because I'm telling you, viruses have had a little bit too much press lately. And I think we can just not talk about them just for this lesson. So we are going to look, so if we look here, we've got domain bacteria or eubacteria, domain archaea. So we've just talked about them. Then we've got domain eukarya. In the eukarya, we have the kingdom protists, animalia, plantae, and fungi. So 1, 2, 3, 4, what Margulis and Schwartz did was they combined these, right? So we call these eukaryotes over here, this group, and this group here prokaryotes, but we don't call the kingdom prokaryote, even though they are prokaryotes. We call it kingdom monera. Okay, so kingdom monera, kingdom protist, kingdom fungi, kingdom plant, kingdom animal or animalia. So, who runs the world? Girls! No. Who runs the world? Bacteria. Bacteria are everywhere. So you can come back and read this graphic more, but you have bacteria all over your body, all over your face, in your eyebrows, in your ears, up your nose, in your hair. You have them inside your gut, inside your body. And if you didn't, you'd probably die, or at least you'd be very sick. We have a very, very intimate relationship with bacteria. A very small number of them, incredibly small number of them, are harmful to us. Most of them are beneficial to us. We evolved with them. We have grown up with them. They are all around, and they are not to be feared, and they are fascinating. Now, we said that within the eukaryotes, okay, so we've got those archaea, which are those extremophiles. We've got the eubacteria, and now we're in the eukaryotes. That's our three domains. Within the eukaryotes, we have these prototists. And these guys, this is like if you're cleaning up your room and you think, okay, I'm going to put all the things that are books or that I need for school, I'll put them over here. And the things that need to go into the bathroom and tidied up in the bathroom, I'll put those in a pile here. And the things that I need to take down to the kitchen, I'll put those here. And then you do that, and you've still got this pile of stuff that you don't know what to do with. There's some kind of bit of cloth that you once used to clean your glasses, and there's a bell, and there's a whistle, and you think like, well, I don't really know what to do with this stuff right now. I don't want to throw it away. I might need that whistle. So you put it all in a box together and kind of leave it to the side for now because you don't know what to do with it. Well, that's what we would call the protists. They are a dustbin kingdom. There's nothing that unifies those things together. There's nothing that, like the whistle and whatever else you put in there, have in common, that bit of cloth. All they have in common is they didn't fit anywhere else. So this is what the prototistan kingdom is all about. And so, for example, an amoeba, you might have heard of an amoeba. It's a single-celled organism that engulfs little particles of food to eat. Foraminiferans, these are things that we quite often find in fossils. Okay, so now we're getting into the more familiar kingdoms. We've got the fungi or fungi. Fungi is a good word to use because you can make a joke about it, something about like, why didn't the mushroom go to the party because he wasn't a fungi, something like that. You can say it either way. So they can be single cells, like yeast that we use to make bread. That is a fungus. They can be in small threads that we call hyphae, and actually these hyphae go all the way across the forest, and those hyphae communicate with the trees and with each other. They're pretty fascinating. Okay, or en masse, like mushrooms, any kind of like the mold that grows on your shower wall. Yeah, like that. That's a fungus. They get their energy from other organisms, and that's what we call a heterotroph. Troph has to do with feeding level. Hetero means different, so they feed on something else, and either they feed on dead or rotting material, and we have the word saprophyte, or they might even feed on something living, in which case they're taking the energy from a living thing, and we call it a parasite. So it could be either. When they're saprophytes, they're super useful because they help break down all the dead and decaying things. They give us nutrients back. We can get fungi growing in our compost. Our compost becomes really usable for growing plants. So I think fungus are pretty useful. Also, of course, we eat some fungus. Okay, so tree shelf fungus. You'll see a lot of fungus around Isaac when you go walking, and there are some edible ones, but please do not eat any fungus unless one of us is with you and tells you that it is definitely okay, and even then we cook it. We've also got fungi up here in this leaf up here, these black blobs. That this is one that is parasitic, and it's attacking a living leaf and can kill that leaf. So that's also a fungus. This is a special kind of fungus. It actually enslaves an algae, and the algae photosynthesizes for it, and the fungus provides a sort of habitat. And this is called a lichen, L-I-C-H-E-N. So there's many different kinds of lichens. Some of them you find on rocks, some of them you find on trees. But you'll see them also a lot in the forest here in Isaac. They're really good pollution indicators, so you can research lichens, and wherever you are in the world right now, go and look at what lichens are out there. Even in cities have lichens on trees. All right, our plants then. Now our plants are multicellular, and so that means that each organism is made up of many cells, and they photosynthesize, so they capture light from the sun. They have cell walls that are made of a substance called cellulose. So because they have a cell wall, we'll be looking at this, but because they have a cell wall, that makes them a little bit crunchy. So you think about celery, it's a plant, it's a bit crunchy, it's got a wall. So they're not soft. And many of them have a vacuole, a space inside the cell that's full of sap that gives it strength. Because think about a plant, it doesn't have a skeleton. It's got to get its structure from somewhere. So it has a rigid cell wall, and it's full like a balloon. So in here we've got mosses, liverworts, which you might not have seen before, but you can see on some of the waterfalls around Karuizawa. Ferns, angiosperms, which are flowering plants, and conifers, which are cone-bearing plants. So here we've got a field of ferns and a field of angiosperms. More angiosperms. This is a cone bearing, so this is a conifer, or gymnosperm, which means naked seed. Here we've got an angiosperm, so this is a flowering plant. And on to our animals. We're getting through it all. So again, they're multicellular eukaryotes. So we've got quite a lot in common with plants. But like fungus, we're heterotrophs. So we eat things that are other things. We can't get our energy directly from the sun. We don't have cell walls because we've got a skeleton, so we're not crunchy. We don't have chloroplasts because we're not fixing energy from the sun, which is what chloroplasts do. And we're not full up like a balloon, okay? All our stuff is kind of contained in different vessels and things. And we're not just sort of like, okay, this is holding me up. Also, we have nervous systems, okay, which plants don't have. So what do we have in there? We have sponges and jellyfish, flatworms and roundworms, sea mats and segmented worms, snails and arthropods, starfish, and then chordates. Chordates are all the things with the backbones, and other many more obscure groups. We don't expect you to memorize all of these, but we know some of you really enjoy learning about them. So they're here for your enjoyment. They're not here for you to stress out, especially if English is your second language. Don't worry about these words. Like, just learn your English first, but it's just fun to know a little bit about them. So here is our cnidarians. These are our sea anemones, our jellyfish, and our corals. And if you've ever been diving or snorkeling, these really do make our oceans very beautiful. Okay, here's some here. Coral is in the cnidarian group, and they're just fixed onto the rock, like these ones. So either soft or hard corals. So a coral is actually an animal. So eukaryote, and it's in the group Animalia. Here we've got segmented worms, and these are fantail worms in the ocean, and then different kinds. Of course, our earthworm, that's in the ground and that we'll find if we do some gardening. This is a ribbon worm, okay, very, very long from the ocean. Linnaeus longissimus, okay. So here's that guy again, Linnaeus. He's got a lot of things named after him. Okay, these are mollusks, all right. So up here, these are like clams and things. So you can get these bivalved mollusks that kind of open and close. I'm not sure what these guys are. Are they like little octopuses or squids? But they also belong in the mollusk group. Chitons, so they're mollusks, but they are stuck onto the rock. And this kind of just like, it's a univalve. It doesn't have, it's not going around like this. It's like a snail. They are mollusks. And I have a feeling that this picture here is in the wrong place. I think this belongs in, well, I'll tell you what, you guys, if you're interested, you figure out where does the chiton belong. There's some beautiful snails. Those are land snails. Ah, there's our octopus. I heard a brilliant story recently about an octopus who stayed on her eggs and didn't move and didn't eat while she hatched her eggs. For 5 years, she didn't move. Can you imagine not eating for 5 years? Wah! My most hated arthropod in the whole world. This is a centipede. Arthropods, ugh. This one, I love all kinds of insects and all kinds of arthropods except for this, because it can bite you and it's really mean. Okay, echinoderms. Echinoderms are our starfish and our sea fans and our sea urchins. You look at the sea urchin, if you imagine a sea star, like a starfish, and if it just folded its legs up and was in that position, then it would make what the sea urchin looks like. Here you can see, this is the sections of the sea urchin here. And then phylum Chordata. This is something called Amphioxus. It's the most simple chordate that there are. What does it mean to be chordata? It means you have a spinal column or a nerve cord, right? A cord running down, spinal cord running down your back. We are in the chordates. All of these guys are fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, all chordates, and Amphioxus down here. And the duck-billed platypus, a very confusing one because it lays eggs, but it is also in the chordates. It is a mammal. That is the end of the show. I hope it didn't overwhelm you. Go back and watch bits of it again, learn what you like to learn, and tell us more about it when we next see you. Bye, guys.